They did not just punish these people, they destroyed them. Men were hanged before sunrise for crimes they never committed. Others lost body parts for offenses so absurd they barely qualified as crimes at all. A rumor was enough. A disagreement with the wrong person was enough.
Electricity shall now be passed through your body until you are dead, in accordance with state law.
Sometimes just being in the wrong place got them buried before anyone noticed they were gone. What they did to the people on this list goes beyond anything most people are prepared to hear. History spent decades trying to bury it. It survived anyway, and you are about to hear every bit of it. Summary hanging. A man could wake up free and be dead before lunch. On the American frontier, an accusation alone was a death sentence. A neighbor could point a finger at a man for stealing a horse, for looking suspicious, for simply being disliked, and within the hour, a rope would be around his neck. The vast majority of those men never got to prove their innocence. Judge Isaac C. Parker sentenced 160 men to hanging in Indian Territory. The most unsettling? He did it with a smile on his face. George Maladin was the man who built that rope. He supervised over 60 executions across 2 decades and took his work seriously in the most disturbing way possible. He soaked each rope in soap. He dried it carefully. One rope he used in 11 separate hangings, and he spoke about it with open pride. He called his method humanitarian. A single execution in 1849 cost over $110, nearly $4,500 today. The rope, the lumber for the gallows, the executioner's fee, and the condemned man's final meals were all itemized. And it was entertainment. Families brought their children. Vendors set up food stalls around the scaffold. Trains arrived packed with spectators who had traveled specifically to watch a man die. When Lincoln's assassination conspirators were executed in 1865, thousands requested tickets. The 1875 Arkansas gallows blueprint included a sloped roof not for the comfort of the condemned, but to keep the crowd dry if it rained. But the crowd sometimes got more than they came for. When the rope was too long, the condemned man's feet would hit the ground the moment the trapdoor opened. He wouldn't die. He would just stand there beneath the platform, half suspended, the rope pulling tight around his throat but not tight enough to finish it. He would claw at the air. He would try to find footing. Guards would have to grab him, haul him back up onto the platform, reposition the rope, and drop him again. Sometimes that still wasn't enough. Sometimes it took 3 attempts before the man finally stopped moving. When the knot was tied correctly, it sat precisely behind the left ear. The drop would then snap the 2nd and 3rd vertebrae on impact, killing the man instantly. That was the intention. That was the merciful version. But when the knot sat even slightly off, too far forward, too far to the side, the vertebrae wouldn't snap. The drop would do nothing but suspend him. The rope would crush his windpipe slowly. His legs would kick. His hands would ball into fists. His face would swell and darken to black while the crowd stood and watched, and the whole thing could last several agonizing minutes before it was over. Blackjack Ketchum hanged in 1901. The rope was measured incorrectly for his weight. The drop didn't break his neck. It tore his head from his body entirely. Executioners had developed weight-based formulas to prevent exactly that outcome. The formulas failed more often than anyone admitted. Blackjack Ketchum was a train robber who had terrorized the Southwest for years. When they finally hanged him in 1901, the executioner miscalculated the rope length for his body weight. The drop didn't break his neck. The force tore his head clean from his body in front of everyone watching. Executioners had developed weight-based formulas specifically to prevent that outcome. The formulas failed more often than anyone admitted. Bill Longley was a convicted horse thief who vigilantes strung up before the state could touch him. The rope snapped on impact. Longley dropped to the ground, alive, got up, and disappeared into the frontier. He believed he had escaped his fate. He hadn't. The state tracked him down, arrested him, and hanged him officially in 1878. This time, the rope finished him. Mass lynching. Summary hanging at least pretended to have rules. Lynching had none. No trial, no pretense of justice. Just a mob that had already decided, and a victim who never had a chance to speak. Men were lynched for being suspected of murder, for owing money to the wrong person, for simply belonging to the wrong race in the wrong town on the wrong night. When a mob decided someone had to die, they didn't wait. They dragged the person from wherever they found them, their home, their jail cell, the middle of the street. They beat them with fists, boots, and whatever was within reach. They stripped them, stabbed them, set them on fire while still breathing, cut off their ears and fingers as souvenirs to pass around the crowd while the person screamed. Then they strung them up, and they watched. Between 1882 and 1968, at least 4,742 people died this way. Not one person was ever punished for it. In Tombstone, Arizona, in 1884, John Heath, a local cowboy and suspected gang organizer, was dragged directly out of his jail cell. The mob believed he had helped plan a robbery that turned deadly, though no one proved it. The mob pulled him through the streets, forced him onto a wagon, and hanged him in the public square. Then they stepped back, watched him die, and went home for dinner as if nothing had happened. Francisco Cotto was only 15 years old, a Mexican immigrant boy living in Los Angeles, when a mob accused him of murdering a woman. Fear spread faster than truth. They did not question his age. They did not question the story. They dragged him down Aliso Street, his body scraping against dirt and stone. People took turns. He cried. He bled. He stayed alive through all of it. By the time they reached the place where they chose to take his life, he could barely stand. They lifted him anyway and tied the rope. The victims were not chosen randomly. Mexicans, Chinese, and Native Americans were targeted in numbers that dwarfed every other group. An estimated 597 Mexicans were lynched between 1848 and 1928 alone. Foreign governments formally condemned the United States for the deaths of their citizens on American soil. Between 1887 and 1903, the State Department paid $480,000 in reparations to China, Italy, Great Britain, and Mexico. The government paid quietly and changed nothing. In the Johnson County War in the 1890s, wealthy Wyoming cattle ranchers hired mercenaries to lynch small settlers disputing land ownership. Money bought the rope. Money chose the target. 2 deputies convicted of second-degree murder for a 1915 lynching were pardoned by the governor within 2 years. The real death toll will never be known. The 4,742 documented cases excluded the bodies never found, the names never recorded, and the murders that entire communities agreed to forget. But perhaps the most revealing detail of all was what came after. Photographers attended lynchings and turned the images into postcards, printed commercially, sold through the United States mail. Crowds posed beneath hanging bodies, smiling as though standing beside a prize catch at a county fair. Some wrote captions on the back describing the day like a family outing. Scalping. Someone would press a blade against the hairline, cut a deep circle around the crown of the skull, grip the hair with both hands, and rip the skin clean off the top of the head. That was scalping. And the most disturbing part was not that it happened. It was that the victim did not need to be dead for it to begin. Scalping was intentionally non-fatal. The procedure was carried out on living, conscious people. When it was over, the person was left with the bone of their skull exposed to open air, bleeding into the ground, still breathing. Some survived for days afterward. Some survived for years. They lived with the wound. Both native tribes and American colonizers practiced it. That is the part history long refused to say out loud. Native tribes had carried out scalping in intertribal conflicts long before colonizers arrived. But then American and Mexican governments introduced bounty payments, meaning they offered official government money to anyone who brought in a scalp as proof that an enemy had been dealt with. They were paying for the skin and hair torn from the heads of the living, men, women, and children. The payment was identical regardless of age. James Kirker was an Irishman who built a career from it. He led teams of mercenaries through Apache territory in the 1830s and 1840s, collecting hundreds of scalps in exchange for those government bounty payments. The practice became so profitable that fraud followed almost immediately. Hunters began bringing in scalps taken from Mexicans and mestizos and presenting them to government officials as Native American scalps. Nobody questioned the origin. Documented cases confirmed that children and babies were not spared. One bounty per scalp meant that infants were worth exactly as much as warriors. The payment structure made no distinctions, so the hunters made none either. The collected scalps were never hidden. They were hung on posts at the edges of settlements, and carried as ornaments. Bounty hunting. They called it bounty hunting. At first it sounded like justice. A man committed a crime, then someone went out to bring him back. But the posters told the truth. They nailed these posters to wood outside saloons and train stations. People gathered around them in silence. The posters had a name, a face, and whatever crime the condemned had committed. Robbery, murder, train heists. Some of it was true. Some of it was rumor. It did not matter. Then came the price. Wanted, dead or alive. That one sentence changed everything. It meant the law did not need the man alive. Anyone with a gun could end a life and still be paid for it. So men began to hunt. They rode out to kill. Bringing someone back alive meant danger. A living man could fight. He could escape. He could turn the gun around. But a dead man stayed still. So they chose the easier way. They shot first. When it was over, they tied the body to a horse and dragged it back. The ground tore the skin. The face broke apart. By the time they reached town, the body barely looked human. Still, they lifted it up for proof. Sometimes they killed the wrong man. A stranger with the same coat, the same height. That was enough. And then there was Robert Ford. He was not just a hunter. He was part of the gang. He rode with Jesse James, one of the most wanted outlaws in the West. Jesse robbed banks and trains. He led violent raids. His name spread fear across entire states, and a large bounty was placed on his head. But Robert Ford was not chasing him from a distance. He lived beside him. He ate with him. Jesse trusted him enough to let him into his home. On April 3, 1882, they stood together inside Jesse's house. It was quiet, no sign of danger. Jesse had taken off his guns. He felt safe. Then he turned his back to straighten a picture on the wall. That was when Robert struck. He raised his gun and fired. Jesse dropped instantly. He never saw it coming. Robert got paid handsomely for bringing the most wanted man down. But something changed after that. People did not see him as a hero. They saw him as a man who betrayed someone who trusted him. The bounty made him hated, so he tried to survive the only way he could. He turned the killing into a performance. He joined traveling shows and small theater acts across towns in the West and Midwest. Posters advertised his name. People paid money to stare at the man who shot Jesse James. Every night, he stepped onto a stage. Another man played Jesse, and he would take the man down just as he did to Jesse that night. The crowd watched it happen again, and again, and again. Some laughed, some cheered, and some were angry, very angry. And 10 years later, he faced the full wrath of his action. A man named Edward O'Kelly walked into a saloon where Robert Ford was standing. He came because he still hated what Robert had done. So he stepped behind him, he raised his gun, and he shot Robert Ford in the back of the head, the same way Robert had done it. Out there, the money did not just buy death, it passed it along. Tarring and feathering. A mob didn't need a court, a judge, or even a real reason to dish out the tarring and weathering punishment. They just needed to decide that someone had gone too far. Tax collectors were dragged out for collecting what the law said they were owed. Land agents were taken for enforcing boundaries that powerful men didn't like. All it took was enough angry people agreeing in the same room. What happened next was one of the most agonizing things one human being could do to another. They would strip the person naked first. Then someone would bring the tar, pine tar or pitch that had been heated to near boiling in a barrel. The moment it touched bare skin, it clung to it, and it burned immediately with the kind of heat that makes a person's mind go blank with shock before the screaming starts. Witnesses described victims going completely hysterical the instant the tar made contact, thrashing and shrieking while the mob held them down and kept pouring. When the burning finally registered and the victim tried desperately to pull the tar away from their own body, the material took the skin with it. Entire patches of flesh came away in their hands. Some people tore at themselves until they had to be physically restrained from causing even greater damage in their panic. Then came the feathers. They would be thrown over the tar while it was still scalding. They stuck immediately and covered the person from head to foot. The crowd roared. The victim stood there, barely conscious, burned across most of their body, covered in feathers, stripped of every shred of dignity, while the mob celebrated around them. Some were then forced onto a rail. They would take a long wooden fence post, press it lengthwise between the victim's bare legs so that all of their body weight bore down directly onto the sharp edge of the wood. Then hoist both ends onto the shoulders of two men and carry them through the main street of town. Every step the carriers took drove the beam harder into the victim's body. The crowd followed and jeered the entire way. The men carrying the rail bounced it deliberately. Everyone present understood what that bouncing was doing. The injuries it caused were severe enough in documented cases to prevent normal movement for weeks. Some victims never fully recovered. When it was finally over, they were dumped at the edge of town and left. Removing the tar was its own separate ordeal. It had fused to the skin so completely that pulling it away meant pulling the skin with it. Every attempt to clean the body reopened the burns. Multiple documented victims survived the punishment itself, only to die days later from infections that spread across the burn wounds before anyone thought to treat them. Collective punishment. One person could commit an offense, and an entire community would burn for it. When a theft was attributed to a Mexican community, the entire settlement suffered. Houses went up in flames. Residents were driven out into open land with nothing. The same fate struck Chinese camps and Native American settlements across the frontier. In 1864, a Cheyenne and Arapaho camp in Sand Creek, Colorado had committed no crime. They had done everything the U.S. government asked of them. They had signed a peace treaty. They had surrendered their weapons. They had settled on the land they were assigned and stayed there. They were flying a white flag of peace directly above the camp as instructed. Elders, women, and children made up the overwhelming majority of people there that morning when disaster struck. Colonel Chivington's troops arrived before dawn while most of the camp was still asleep. When the people woke to the sound of horses and weapons, mothers grabbed their children and ran toward the white flag, certain the soldiers would see it and stop. They didn't stop. More than 150 people lost their lives before the morning was over. The majority were women, children, and elderly people who never raised a hand against anyone. Then the soldiers moved slowly through the camp afterward. They took scalps. They removed body parts from the fallen, from women, from children. They rode back to Denver with those remains stretched over their saddle horns and hat brims like decorations. When they arrived, the city celebrated. Crowds lined the streets and cheered as the soldiers passed through. The army wrote it up as a battle. The mothers who had run toward that white flag with their children in their arms had another word for it. Collective punishment worked because it sent a message that no community on the frontier ever fully forgot. Step out of line and everyone you know will pay for it. Prolonged captivity. When Yuma Territorial Prison opened in Arizona in 1876, the first 7 prisoners didn't arrive to find cells waiting for them. They arrived with pickaxes and shovels and were ordered to carve the prison out of the granite hillside with their bare hands under the Arizona sun. They hauled adobe bricks. They broke rock. They dug into the earth in temperatures that could stop a man's heart. When they finally finished, when the walls stood and the bars were in place, they walked inside and the doors locked behind them. They had built their own cage, and now they would live in it. Over 3,000 prisoners passed through Yuma across 33 years. They lived in cells where summer temperatures regularly exceeded 122 degrees. Men convicted of robbery, assault, and murder rotted in those cells alongside men convicted of far smaller offenses. The frontier made no meaningful distinction. When a prisoner broke the rules, attempted escape, fought a guard, spoke out of turn, guards stripped him down to his underwear and threw him into the dark cell. 100 square feet of total darkness. No light, no ventilation, no sound except whatever was moving across the floor in the blackness. The stone walls had been deliberately positioned to absorb maximum heat from the desert sun, turning the space into a sealed oven. Snakes and scorpions shared the darkness with whoever was locked inside. Stale bread and water came once a day. Anyone who had previously attempted escape had chains bolted to their ankles before the door closed. Within 24 to 48 hours, men in that cell began losing their grip on reality. The heat brought hallucinations first, then the body started shutting down. Some suffered organ failure before anyone opened the door again. Outside those walls, the public had a completely different concern. Yuma had electricity. It had a hospital. It had a library stocked with 2,000 books and a band made up of prisoners who performed on weekends. Locals called it the Country Club of the Colorado. They complained that criminals were living better than honest citizens. The outrage never stopped. Neither did the dark cell. 111 prisoners died inside Yuma. Most were taken by tuberculosis. 6 men were routinely packed into cells built for far fewer, sleeping inches apart, breathing the same infected air every single night. Getting tuberculosis in Yuma was not a question of if, it was a question of when. The authorities were fully aware. They changed nothing. Among those who passed through were Pearl Hart, who had robbed a stagecoach dressed as a man, and buckskin Frank Leslie, considered one of the fastest gunmen of his era. Yuma held the famous and the forgotten with identical indifference. The prison closed in 1909. The building eventually became a school. When the school's team defeated Phoenix in competition, the opposing side called them criminals as an insult. The students carried the name with pride. To this day, they are called the Yuma criminals. Forced banishment. A man would wake up, walk to his door, and find a note nailed into the wood. No name on it, no explanation, just a single instruction: get out before dawn. On the frontier, banishment was handed out for suspected theft, for being an outsider, for disagreeing with the wrong person, for existing in a space where someone more powerful had decided you no longer belonged. Vigilance committees in mining towns typically made sure the message landed harder than words alone. They would find the man first. They would flog him until he could barely stand. Then they would point toward the desert and tell him to start walking. He would leave with nothing, not even water. Death by dehydration in the Arizona desert takes between 12 and 24 hours. The body stops sweating first, then the skin begins to crack. Confusion sets in, then seizures, then organ failure. All while the person remains fully conscious for most of it, crawling toward towns or water sources that were often 50 or more miles away. Some banishments were deliberately timed for the hottest months and carried out at midday. Those who survived long enough to reach the next town found closed doors. Travelers in Colorado described settlements where banished men were refused entry everywhere they went. Those who ignored the original warning and stayed were found hanging from trees, or they were simply never found at all. The frontier had a way of making people disappear without anyone having to admit they were responsible. Mutilation as punishment. Whatever part of your body you used to commit the crime, that was the part they took as punishment. A horse thief didn't just lose his freedom. In some territories, he lost the fingers of his riding hand, or had the tendons cut so cleanly that he could never grip reins effectively again. A pickpocket lost his fingers publicly. Someone would hold him down in the street, and whoever had a suitable blade would step forward. Not a surgeon, not even someone with training. A hatchet, a bowie knife, a meat cleaver. All were documented instruments used for finger amputations on the frontier. A clean cut was never guaranteed. Sometimes the blade didn't go all the way through on the first strike. Sometimes it took several. The person pinned to the ground felt every single one of them, screaming into the dirt while the crowd watched and nobody looked away. A man convicted of lying under oath could have his tongue removed. The instrument that had caused the injustice was the instrument destroyed. For adultery, some frontier courts borrowed directly from Native American tribal justice systems and Spanish colonial law and ordered the removal of the nose. Not at the cartilage. At the base of the nasal bone, leaving the facial structure visibly collapsed inward. When the cutting was done, the wound was packed with gunpowder and ignited to cauterize it. Survivor accounts describe that moment. The burning that followed the blade as more agonizing than the mutilation itself. The person would be held down screaming through the cutting and then held down again through the burning. Every mutilation was carried out in public. The wound was left open to the elements afterward with no medical care provided or expected. Infection killed a significant number of those who had survived the procedure itself, and those who lived carried the scars permanently on their bodies. Missing fingers. Forced labor. Forced labor was one of the most extreme punishments. Offenders would be chained and sent off to work in horrible conditions. The chain weighed up to 33 pounds. It connected one man to the next, 10 to 20 men linked together in a single line. They worked chained. They slept on the ground chained to the same men they had spent the day breaking rocks beside. If one man fell, the chain pulled the others down with him. If one man tried to run, the iron dragged everyone connected to him off their feet. There was no privacy. There was no rest. Men were sent to this for vagrancy, for drunkenness, for fabricated offenses that existed purely to fill the labor rolls. The 13th Amendment had abolished slavery but left one sentence open, except as punishment for crime. That single loophole was all the frontier needed. A free man could be arrested in the morning and chained to a work gang by afternoon. Thousands were imprisoned for offenses that no longer exist in any law book today. Private companies paid the government pennies per day to rent these men. Mining companies took them underground. Railroad companies put them on the tracks. Farmers in Texas and Louisiana worked them on cotton and sugarcane plantations that looked identical to the fields that had existed before abolition. Guards stood over them with whips and shotguns. Resistance meant less food. It meant more hours. It sometimes meant a shot that nobody investigated because there were always more prisoners coming through the gates to replace whoever had fallen. The chains tore the skin around the ankles open. The wounds had their own name, shackle sores. The flesh would split, become infected, turn gangrenous in the heat. Doctors were almost never called. When a man's body finally gave out and he could no longer lift a pickaxe or drag a plow, they didn't treat him. They chained him to a post and left him there without food or medical care until he stopped breathing. Then they buried him in an unmarked grave on prison grounds and wrote natural causes in the record. His family was never told. Children as young as 10 years old moved through this system. Arrested on minor or invented charges, they were chained alongside grown men in mines so dangerous and conditions so lethal that some states recorded prison death rates exceeding 30% annually during the busiest leasing years. Ear cropping. A man could be dragged to the public square and have his ear cut off for something as small as stealing food or being caught with someone else's horse. Someone would produce whatever blade was available. Not a surgical instrument, a hunting knife, a skinning blade, something that had likely not been cleaned since its last use. While the man was held down and restrained in front of whoever had gathered to watch, the blade would cut away part or all of one ear, sometimes both. The crowd watched it happen. Some of them had brought their children. Then came the part that broke men who had held themselves together through the cutting. A hot iron was pressed immediately against the open wound to seal it. The severed ear was sometimes nailed to the courthouse door afterward. A small, quiet announcement to everyone passing by about what happened to people who stepped out of line. The man who survived it carried the verdict on his face permanently. Anyone who looked at him knew immediately what he had been convicted of. Towns refused him entry. Employers turned him away. Trades closed their doors. The frontier had ensured that rebuilding any kind of honest life was nearly impossible. Water torture. Vigilante groups and frontier interrogators used water specifically because it left no evidence that anything had happened at all. They needed a confession to destroy whoever they wanted. Without one, a public hanging looked like murder. With one, it looked like justice. So they would take a man before any trial, break him until he admitted to whatever they had already decided he was guilty of, and then drag that confession into court as proof. A man could be destroyed completely on the inside and walk into a courtroom the next morning looking untouched, and the men who had broken him would walk away clean because no mark on the body meant no crime had been committed. There were two ways they did it. The first was to tie the person flat on their back, chain their hands above their head so they couldn't lift them, stretch them out so they couldn't move, and lay a cloth over their face. Then someone would pour water slowly and continuously over the cloth. The fabric held the water against the nose and mouth. The person could not breathe. Every instinct in their body told them they were drowning because they were drowning. The panic was immediate and total. Men who had faced gunfights and frontier violence without flinching came apart within seconds. They screamed through the cloth. They threw their bodies against the restraints until their wrists bled. And still the water kept coming until whoever was pouring it decided to stop. The second method was simpler. They would take the person to a river, a trough, or a barrel and hold them under. They would pull them up just before consciousness left, wait until the gasping slowed and push them back down, over and over. Each time the person came up, they would be given the same question. Each time they refused to answer, they went back under. Some sessions lasted hours. Those who refused to break were left barely conscious in a cell and brought back the following day, and the day after that. Men subjected to multiple sessions stopped eating, they stopped sleeping. They sat in their cells, staring at nothing, flinching at the sound of rain against the walls. The cruelest part was what a confession actually meant. It bought nothing. The moment a man broke and gave them what they wanted, he was taken directly to the gallows. The confession didn't save him. It simply gave his execution the appearance of legitimacy. Those who survived without confessing carried the water with them for the rest of their lives. Documented accounts describe men who could not bring themselves to bathe, to cross rivers, or to stand in rainfall for years afterward. The body had forgotten how to trust water as anything other than a weapon. Some sessions went too far and the person never came back up. Those deaths were recorded as natural causes.